Hi, this is Craig from the University of Applied Research and Development. And schools, educational organisations and caregivers are often poorly informed regarding the status of the adverse childhood experiences that young people have gone through. And this impacts the way that they're cared for, they're educated, and their opportunities in society. Now, I say that because of this great article, which has just come out recently from the Netherlands, called The Prevalence of Adverse Childhood Experiences in Students with Emotional and Behavioural Disorders in Special Education Schools from a Multi-Informant Perspective. Now, what does that mean? It means that when young people are growing up, they've gone through adverse experiences in their childhood, negative experiences. They may be from small to really large and impacting adverse childhood experiences, but often the information around those adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, that information is received from either an agency that may have impacted or been interacting with a child over a period of time, or it might come from a parent's report, might come from a school, or it might come from the child themselves, but it comes from one or maybe two sources of information. And this great article looks at different childhood experiences, adverse childhood experiences, from a multi-informant perspective. Now, why is this important? When students have emotional or behavioural disorders, often they express themselves because of a lack of emotional self-regulation. That means that the young person has difficulty controlling how they respond to certain situations, how they cope with difficulties. In New Zealand, over a 50-year period, over 1,000 people have been tracked from the 1970s all the way through to the age of 32. The difference maker for those people from early childhood all the way through school to young adulthood to now heading towards middle age, the difference maker for them was the emotional self-regulation, their ability to feel and cope with the emotions that they were having. You see, emotional self-regulation, being able to manage one's emotions and then respond effectively, is the difference maker between financial status, educational outcomes, teen pregnancy, incarceration, and a general sense of well-being. So coping skills is the number one differentiator. There's another article that I would just point to, and this is a summary of the last 10 years data on students' well-being compared to emotional regulation or self-regulation. Just want to point out two particular points, and then we'll jump back to the other important article. And there are two important points from this article. You see I'm scrolling through. Coping strategies, how we cope, and the style of coping was seen to be an explanatory factor for the sense of purpose and satisfaction with life. What does this mean? See, if we're experiencing strong emotions about a particular situation, we could choose to cope with that by learning some breathing techniques. I'm shutting my eyes and imagining I'm using a breathing technique, or we could choose to physically lash out at the person in that situation. Now, the former, using some breathing techniques, is a more productive and positive coping strategy versus lashing out physically at the people that are involved in that situation. So the coping style is a difference maker for a sense of purpose in life and satisfaction with life. Again, in the conclusion, secondly, if we want to improve different outcomes for young people and their sense of well-being in life, we need to really focus not only on the now, but the future outcomes of spending time on academic goal setting, choosing academic goals, planning for academic goals, giving them support and encouragement and training consistently and persistently. See, education and educational goals can be a difference maker, according to this research. So let's jump in and have a look at some of these adverse childhood experiences and anchor it into some real truth and what the data is telling us. I'm just going to skip through the article and show you some things that are really noticeable. So many of the factors affecting young people in their schooling success and whether they're moved from the mainstream into special education are their emotional or behavioural disorders, and the cause of those are their adverse childhood experiences. And what does this do? It means that it's a really intense response is needed for those young people. Also, they place a high demand on the schooling system and those who care for them. Additionally, there are persistent and ongoing difficulties that are quite severe for those young people, their peers, and for their teachers that need to be coped with. But how they are coped with is the important thing. How they are trained and supported to cope with them is the important thing. Often these young people will drop out. They have reduced school performance. Their social and relational outcomes are much lower. They may end up in prison and they disconnect from employment opportunities. And these are the outcomes from having adverse childhood experiences which produce emotional and behavioral disorders, and then they get relocated or moved into a special education system or an education system which doesn't actually deal with the root causes to support them to cope effectively, to have a sense of well-being and a sense of purpose to achieve those things in life that we all want: emotional, financial, spiritual, physical, safety, well-being, and a sense of purpose. So there are many unintended effects of them having that move from mainstream into special education. So let's have a look at the data. I'm just going to run through here. And it's the accumulation of these adverse childhood experiences. They may have one negative childhood experience, which encourages them or causes them to have a negative emotional response or a behavioral response, which then there is a consequence for the way that people respond to them, which leads to another adverse childhood experience. And these tend to build up on top of each other. So I just want to run through the timing, the prevalence, and the type of different adverse experiences that children experience. So the majority of the participants in the study from the Netherlands, that had about half of the participants were from the Netherlands and half were from a really big range of different ethnicities. 85% of them were male, the rest were, of course, female. And so the majority of them came from a single parent household. So this shows us that children experiencing adverse childhood experiences and have been moved into a place of special education because of emotional or behavioral disorders come from a single parent household. And notice also that 43%, just over 43% of the main income earner or earners in those households said that they couldn't identify their educational achievement or their educational level. That information was missing, either because they had not had educational achievement, or they didn't carry records of educational achievement, or they just weren't submitted to give a bigger picture of the information around that young person. So that's a pretty strong piece of data to identify what really were the educational outcomes for the parents, the main income earners of these children that have adverse childhood experiences. So many of these children, over 40%, had more than one switch in schooling. They'd moved from one school to another, or they'd moved from mainstream to special education or extreme intensive care or back again. So more than one school switch was in the background of these children that had emotional and behavioral disorders and adverse childhood experiences. And also it's important to note that over 41% of these students had more than one diagnosis, meaning more than one issue had been diagnosed for them in terms of their emotional or behavioral disorders. Now, just going to scroll through. While the researchers were looking at the data and looking at the responses, the adverse childhood experiences list of adverse childhood experiences didn't encompass all of the negative experiences that young people might go through. The other category that was found by talking to schools or parents or children was becoming quite large. So the researchers very wisely started asking deeper questions and found that there was a wider range of adverse childhood experiences than actually in the original list, such as a near drowning experience or the death of a sibling, that needed to be included into the questions they were asking. As you can imagine, that is an adverse childhood experience. So the majority or many of the students had over 8 different adverse childhood experiences. Over 40% of them had over 8 adverse childhood experiences. So sex was not a determining factor whether they're male or female. And the majority of them In fact, all of them reported being bullied or victimized because of their behaviors. So this is building up a picture of adverse childhood experiences, leading to emotional and behavioral disorders, leading to bullying and peer victimization, leading to that child having a type of response given to them in the educational system. But what is that type of response given to them? So here we can see over 71% or 71% of them reported being physically abused, over 10% sexually abused, and over 8% had been forced to be somewhere. And I want you to note that the number of students, the percentage who said that they had been sexually abused was over 10%, but the parents of those children, 2.1%, had reported a sexual abuse situation for a child. Over 10% compared to 2%. This is why a multi-informant perspective is needed to build up the full picture of what are the adverse childhood experiences that cause these emotional and behavioral disorders that have caused the child to be moved out of mainstream schooling. So this is why more information is needed when we decide what do we do to really help this child become a young person who's successful. Community stresses were quite large. You notice that community stresses reported by children were much, much higher than reported by their parents, such as being stalked, violence in the neighborhood, or reportings of shooting. Traffic accidents, and I wanted to point this out because often children see things that we don't know they've seen. They see things that they may not have told us about, or we may not have asked a question about as a school or as a family or as a caregiver. And students and children see things, and then those images, those experiences stay with them as a negative experience, which can produce emotional and behavioral disturbances or disorders that we just don't know that they have been through as a cause. Someone hurting them or someone being hurt that they love. Notice the numbers are much higher from the self-reports. Just going to scroll through quite quickly now and notice that this age range of where these adverse childhood experiences were being experienced by the children, nearly 46% of these children experienced these adverse experiences before the age of 3 and up to the age of 3. And before the age of up to 11, you can see it's a very, very large number. So 46 plus roughly 30 plus 7%. If we're heading up towards 80% of children, and over 80% of children before the age of 11 are experiencing all of these adverse childhood experiences, you can see why a response at an earlier age is needed. But what type of response is needed for these young people? Let's just jump down to the end here. The research really does note that there's an accumulation of adverse childhood experiences. A multi-informant perspective is needed. And also, we need to identify a trauma-informed care response. What does this mean? We don't just look at the emotions that are being expressed. We don't just look at the behaviors that are being expressed. We don't just look academically, what are their goals, but we go back to the point of this child, this young person, this adult has experienced trauma. And 45 to 46% of these young people we're looking at experience this trauma under the age of 3. 80% of them have experienced this trauma before or up to the age of 11. Trauma-informed care, a recognition of that trauma and dealing with that trauma and helping the young person to work through that trauma is paramount and extremely important, because that needs to happen first before the emotions and the behaviors are dealt with, before then finally the educational outcomes are focused on. I wish to jump down just to a final conclusion point. These adverse childhood experiences need to be addressed as early as possible to prevent an accumulation of further adverse childhood experiences, such as peer victimization and bullying, because of the emotional and behavioral disorders that are expressed by the young person. There will be long-lasting impacts unless parents, children, agencies, schools all work together with a multi-informant perspective to develop a response that recognizes the trauma and then focuses on the emotions and the behaviors to then double down and consistently and persistently work on educational goals to bring about a positive outcome for young people. So I'm Craig Hansen from the University of Applied Research and Development. And for us at the university, it's incredibly important that we notice the changes in responses to dealing with young people in the classroom or adults in the classroom. And we build an trauma-informed care approach for those that are struggling and a multi-informant approach. So I'd encourage you to look at this article that I've shared with you, and also the Swiss article, which I mentioned at the beginning, and also the Dunedin study from New Zealand to look at the self-regulation, the emotional regulation, and the impacts on adult success. I'll put the links in the video notes, wherever you're watching this recording on YouTube or in other places, so that you can look at the data yourself and come to your own conclusions. Thanks very much for watching. I look forward to seeing you again.